everybody. This is Jess from 3D Learning Experts, and you're listening to the LD Experts Podcast, the show for busy parents who want to help their kids with learning disabilities, or as I like to say, learning differences, go from surviving to thriving.
Hello, everybody. Today, we have the privilege to hear from Shannon Iacobacci, who is an expert on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And she is going to talk to us about the connection with FASD and IEPs. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. Yes, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself before we get into anything. Again, my name is Shannon, and I came into understanding about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder first and foremost as a parent. I am a parent of 6 children, 4 of which have a varying different degrees of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and other neurodiverse conditions. So I came into the knowledge in regards to that as a parent. Basically, I did not know about it for a very long period of time. And we started to see, there were a few things that I didn't understand that were happening behavior-wise, academically, socially. And it wasn't until I would say my youngest came home and we started seeing even more of behavior challenges. And I was, a little concerned, like what's going on? What do we do? And someone had mentioned to me the possibility of this fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So I did some research and I looked into it, and I was able to speak to an expert, a medical doctor that was an expert in the field. And sure enough, my children were diagnosed with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Now, all that to say that FASD is actually not in the United States an actual medical diagnosis. It's actually an umbrella term for alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disabilities. So you may hear different types of other diagnoses associated with it. So it was about that time that my husband and I decided to find some training in regards to that. And we found that there wasn't very much. There was not a lot of knowledge about FASD. And so we did find a wonderful organization that shared with us about the brain and the differences in brain function and brain structure due to the teratogen of alcohol, which I'll explain about that, and what interventions were going to be some starter strategies to help in having our children grow and learn and work through the challenges that they were going to have. So that's kind of how I came into it. So since then, been certified and trained and all the things, and finishing up some extra education with my master's degree, and I'm almost done. I'm very excited about that. So you might be asking yourself, what is FASD? What is this fetal alcohol spectrum disorder? Well, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is when alcohol is consumed during pregnancy and it affects the developing fetus. And so what happens is alcohol is what they call a teratogen, and it can cross the placenta that knows no barriers. There's no age, race, ethnic background, anything that will stop this teratogen from entering into the placenta. And depending on how much alcohol was consumed and the timing of the alcohol will depend on what brain domains are affected, or which neurons are affected, or which different structures are affected. So the hard part about that is a lot of women may not know they're pregnant. And a lot of times there's a misconception out there, or misunderstanding that it's okay if I didn't know I was pregnant, or if I have a glass of wine during pregnancy. There's that misconception that the baby's going to be just fine. And that may be true. There may not be an effect. However, the chances are that teratogen is going to enter the bloodstream of the fetus, and it is going to impact the central nervous system. And so there is really no safe timing, type, or amount of alcohol to consume during pregnancy. Add to that there are usually about 45% of pregnancies are unplanned. And so that also can skew the data, not skew the data, but shows you that there might be a lot of alcohol consumed without knowledge of being pregnant. The prevalence of FASD, in a recent study in 2018, the JAMA articles published that probably conservatively speaking, 1 in 20 are affected by FASD. And that is higher than the rates of autism. And yet there are very minimal services that are out there for individuals with FASD. So that is basically kind of a real quick Reader's Digest version of what is FASD. There is a misconception also, or a misunderstanding, that facial features are important or common in order to diagnose whether a child or an individual has FASD, and that is in fact not true. The standard is there are no facial features. I don't want to say no facial features. There's only 3 really that they've narrowed it down to. But usually you cannot tell by looking at an individual if they have FASD. Add to that, if there are genetic differences, there's racial differences. Everyone has a different face shape anyway. And so you can't look at an individual. And then as a child grows into teens and adulthoods, their face changes. So you can't look at somebody and say, oh, they have FASD. Okay. So it is really an invisible disability because it affects the brain. So I hope that's kind of given a little more information there. I'm trying to think of how I want to bridge the gap here. So FASDs and IEPs are my passion. And because a lot of individuals with FASD are misunderstood. And a lot of times what happens is there are behaviors that happen due to being misunderstood. And unfortunately, these children become labeled. They receive intervention strategies that are considered research-based or evidence-based practices, but they're not effective for this population because of the way that the alcohol has impacted the brain. So teachers and admins and therapists become frustrated because those strategies that are supposed to be proven to help these individuals might not work. And so we have to come up with creative strategies that are individualized and strengths-based to help this population. So that is what I do, and that's what I like to do to help these individuals. Yes.
So is it more behavior or academic, or is it a balance of both, or does it just depend?
It honestly depends. There are some standards that you can say, okay, this individuals with FASD typically struggle with, let's say, math. Math is abstract, especially when you start getting to certain types of things. Abstract thinking. There are memory challenges. There are cause and effect challenges. In other words, not being able to learn from their mistakes, difficulty generalizing. There are challenges. There are cognitive deficits. There are comprehension deficits at times. And so, but it's going to be individualized because depending on when that alcohol was introduced is going to impact which brain domain is impacted. So you can have an individual who's intact at the base of the brain, but they have a hard time regulating their emotions because that's part of the frontal lobe. That's part of the, yes, I have my limbic system in place, but I do not know how to regulate those emotions. I do not know how to do certain executive functioning issues because when my brain was developing, if I was going on this path and, I hit a teratogen, I had to go this way to develop. So it takes a different route for me to understand. There could be processing, there could be sensory, there could be language and communication. So there's all sorts of different things that can happen, and no 2 individuals are going to be exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what makes it hard for teachers because, you're in a classroom of 30 students possibly, and you're trying to do all these, interventions and strategies that have been proven. And you have all these students to handle, and yet you have this individual with FASD that what you're trying isn't working. So now what? There's that now what question. And to answer your question about behaviors come along because if I am not being understood, and I'm being told to do something and I'm not being understood, I'm going to have stress and frustration. And I don't know how to communicate any other way, but I react, And so a good way to think about it also is an individual, just like a child from trauma also, obviously affects the brain. And we're very aware of that. Individuals with FASD, it's almost as if they're a child of trauma as well, and they're constantly at this little simmering point. Okay. So think of a pot of water on a stove. They're like this, their nervous system, all of it. And something happens that they don't understand or triggers them, and they can boil over like that. And it's not that it's willful. It's not that they want to. It's just a reaction, and it's based on the disability that they have. And that's where a shift and a reframing of the behavior needs to take place. Understanding it's a manifestation of that physical disability.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that very often happens with people with dyslexia, where, like myself, I had a lot of behavior problems as a kid and it all started at the same year that I got held back in school. So it took me 40 something years to realize the connection of my behavior issues and my frustration. So I have a question about people who have FASD versus dyslexia, because like I told you when we spoke before, we've helped a lot of students who are adopted and they presumably have fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. However, we have been able to help them. Is it that they have dyslexia as well, or is it that the characteristics are so similar that we can help them because it's similar to dyslexia? Do you know the answer to that?
Well, I wouldn't say it's necessarily similar to dyslexia. Okay. Now, saying all these things does not about individuals with FASD does not mean that an individual is going to have all of these symptoms.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay? Right. And an individual with FASD it's not that an individual with FASD can't learn. Okay. I have a child that has FASD, but also has dyslexia.
Okay.
And so it's not in and of, there can be multiple diagnoses on top of FASD. Okay. So I hope that answers your question.
Oh, right. Yeah, that definitely did. Because, a lot of the things you were describing sound like some of the characteristics of dyslexia. So Correct. That's why I wondered if it just presented itself as one and the same. But what you're saying is no. But like everything else, people have comorbid learning challenges. And so that would be the case with the students that we worked with. It was comorbid dyslexia and FASD.
Correct. And what you'll find is if an individual, and I'm not sure, I'm just going through learning about dyslexia because of my child having dyslexia. So I'm not well versed on it. I'll be honest there. However, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I love to learn. Individuals with dyslexia, my question would be, do these individuals, what's the word I'm looking for? Perform well with, say, rewards versus consequences, or, those types of what are the words? Incentives. Do they perform well as they learn with that, or do you see resistance in those types of strategies with individuals with dyslexia?
I wouldn't see resistance because of their dyslexia. It would be their personality. But what we find with our students is because our program works in a way that they understand, we don't see resistance that parents see before bringing their kids to us.
Okay. And the reason why I ask that is because typically individuals with FASD, regardless if they have dyslexia or any other specific learning disability, usually will not perform well based on incentive programs or rewards and consequence systems or things like that. And I say that specifically because a lot of time, I don't want to say a lot of times, but it's hard for them to grasp the concepts sometimes or to measure up to that expectation. Like, for example, if my child had a sticker chart or a rewards chart in the classroom, there's no way by the end of the week that they would even be able to make it, and they know it, that they can't do these tasks or perform these behaviors because they have no control of these behaviors sometimes. And so they already know that come the end of the week, when Susie and Johnny are getting something out of the treasure chest because they've had amazing behaviors and they've done well on their stuff, they already know they're going to be the one that's not going to be able to do that because they don't have that ability to regulate emotions. They don't have the ability to self-initiate. They don't have the ability to whatever that struggle or challenge is for them. And that's why I had asked that question.
Yeah. So when I tutored in person, we had a prize box. And at the end of the tutoring session, all of the students would get to pick a prize because it just incentivized them to be excited to come to tutoring.
Right.
The younger ones. It wasn't tied to their abilities because they learned what they were there for that day. Either way. Now that we tutor online 100%, we don't have a prize box. You know,
right.
So they don't.
Your resort is you can come in your pajamas to your tutoring.
Yeah. But like one of my tutors, she she's a very energetic person, and so she will give the kids virtual stickers to encourage them, I guess. But that's her personality that's giving those stickers, not something that will get the kids to cooperate for that reason, because my other tutors don't do that necessarily.
Right.
And their students are continuing to improve as well. Right.
Well, that's good. That's good that they can, I know a lot of individuals with FASD really struggle with online mental health, online services. A lot of individuals with FASD are very relational. And one of the things that that can separate them from, because autism is a very common common misdiagnosis. Okay. And so is FASD. I'm sorry, ADHD with FASD. It's the highest. Those are two highest.
ADHD ones. Sounded similar as well. It sounded
like
dyslexia and ADHD when you were describing it.
Right. And so now I'm trying to think of where I was going at with my.
Sorry.
No. It's fine. Oh, I know what it's saying. Relational. They're relational, and what I mean by that is, what sets them apart from individuals that are autistic or that have autism. They sometimes I've heard that they struggle with relationships as far as they don't want to be with people, or they're very good at being alone and independent. But a lot of individuals with FASD, what they call they fuse. They don't just have a relationship; they meld themselves with that person. And so relationships are very important. It's hard for them though, because they fuse, but it's hard for them to remain friends. They have a really difficult time with friends. And so a lot of times they'll fuse to somebody, but then that breaks off because of the inability to handle, maintain a friendship, or they can be easily manipulated or things like that. So that is one way to kind of see, a little bit now, and that's not for, and again, it's not a blanket statement. It's not stereotypical of everybody. It's just a general thought process, I should say, or something that has been observed.
Well, and so when you're talking about these certain characteristics that develop, what do you know at what point the alcohol is causing it? Because when we were talking before, I had mentioned where I went to a Christmas party and I didn't want to take my pregnancy test until after the Christmas party because I wanted to drink without guilt. And that was a month into my pregnancy. So, what is the point of no return? Or is is there a defined point of no return?
Honestly, the common consensus is there's no safe timing, type, or amount of alcohol that is safe to consume during pregnancy or trying to conceive, because the chance is too high. If it's preconception, there's high possibility of miscarriages. There's so many other different things that can happen. The central nervous system starts, developing by week 3. I think the first 2 weeks is just the cell development, but everything's forming right at the beginning. And so anything introduced during that time is you're taking a gamble, and it can affect the growing fetus. And think of it this way. If you think of, I'm trying to think of the best way to give an analogy here. When you're growing something, right? And you have or you're building something. Okay, I'm going to build a block wall. Okay, so I'm going to build a block wall, and here's my foundation. If I happen to take a brick and leave a brick out because I've introduced alcohol, how am I going to build that next level? And then as I keep going, how's that going to work if I have all these different holes? How am I going to fill that in to make the wall strong and stable and able to do its job, right? To do its job and function well. If I've got a hole in the bottom and I'm trying to build a block wall, is that going to help me, or is that going to give me a challenge with what my purpose of my block wall is? And I don't know if that's the best analogy, but that's all I could think of off the top of my head.
No, I think that's very helpful. Now, for me, it made me wonder, so is it every time you have a drink, one of your blocks doesn't fill in? Like if you had a drink at week 6 and you had a drink at week 12 and you had 5 drinks at week 15, are you not filling in parts of those blocks every time you have the drink?
It is highly possible, yes. And what happens is, because the alcohol enters the maternal bloodstream, right? It also crosses the placenta. But then what ends up happening is okay, how to explain this without going into too much science, but basically, long after the effects of the alcohol has worn off on the mother, on the pregnant woman, it's still processing in the fetus, because the baby's organs are not fully developed to be able to process that. Then add to it, there comes a point in the development where the baby can excrete, things from its system. Well, what ends up happening is it's in the amniotic fluid. So not only do they get it the first time, they recycle it. So it recycles in that amniotic fluid. Okay, and their bodies are unable to process that at the rate that an adult can process the alcohol. So are you taking a chance? The answer is yes, you really are taking a chance. And depending on, like you said, week 3 or 8 versus week 12 versus whatever, it depends on what is growing at that time. It is depending on what is developing during that time that you drink that you have that alcohol. Yeah.
And so what about when you're breastfeeding? Is that a totally different game?
That is a very good question. And there's a lot of opinions, I should say, on that. I am not a doctor, so I don't know if the breast milk is affected. There are some that say it is, because, whatever you eat, they say whatever you eat, your baby gets, right? It would be the same for whatever you drink. So the alcohol would be still being presented in the breast milk, although it might not be as much as when they're in utero.
Well, and now, I know they would say pump and dump. Like if you go out and drink, pump and dump. But but you don't know how much you should be dumping.
Correct. That's okay. You don't know how much you'd have been to dump. Exactly. How long does it take your body to manufacture that breast milk? And how many times do you have to dump before it's completely out of your system? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
So it's a valid question. I think there's a lot of research that hasn't necessarily been done, or that I haven't seen yet, in regards to the breast milk question.
Well, and another question that I had while you were talking was, I was thinking about how in the 50s, women drank all through their pregnancy.
Yep.
So shouldn't those generation of people being born in the 50s or the 60s, probably even, be more affected? Or are they? And they just, education was different back then.
I think that, and this is my personal opinion, is that individuals were impacted, but there wasn't knowledge about it. So it would have been the individuals that society might have labeled as whatever it might have been back in the day, whatever the terminology would have been. It could have been anywhere from an intellectual disability to not labeled at all because they're functioning completely well in society, which is highly capable, right? Highly, highly possible. And actually a lot. So it's just that we may have had FASD and didn't know it. And our interventions were maybe traumatizing to us, but I don't know, we just didn't have the awareness of it. And so people reacted to it in different ways than they do now. You know, I don't know what they did.
And the pressures of life have gotten more intense for kids every generation. So,
right. I mean, there wasn't the internet. If you were the person that didn't want to be around people, you could be the person that didn't want to be around people, because we didn't live in community, I don't know how, I wasn't obviously born in the 50s, but there were people had land, people had places to go, people had different ways to deal with how whatever it was that they were, and people were celebrated differently too. Our measure of success back in the 50s is very different than today. You worked in whatever it was with your hands, you were valuable back then. Well, that's honestly, a lot of individuals with FASD are very kinesthetic or mechanically inclined or creative or musical. And so those individuals were celebrated for their differences back then. Mm-hmm. And it was our shift in education and our shift in what was valuable for success and our shift in all these different things that now, and this is my opinion, so, but that now it's like individuals that struggle with FASD are held to different standards that are super frustrating for them. If we would allow them to learn in a way that, education itself kind of has changed, kind of hasn't. But there were many more field trips, many more hands-on opportunities. In high school, you had auto shop and home ec and all these different things back then, that cosmetology, whatever, they don't have those these days. Those have been removed. Right. And so individuals with FASD are up against a different set of challenges than they were back in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, and I agree with you completely, because that's what I say about dyslexia. Like Leonardo da Vinci was celebrated for his out-of-the-box style of doing sculpture, right. And he was dyslexic, where today we don't have mentors that teach people how to do things. They have to go to school and read books. And so reading becomes more important than it was back in the 1400s.
Right. And so when we think about that shift right there, technology and education and all the things are wonderful. And we also need to think of a different approach to individuals that may not fit in that pigeonhole category. They're not able to fit in that box that we're trying to put them in. So what do we do to help this population feel and be successful to the extent of their abilities, right? And I think that because it's invisible, it's even harder. People in society are more accepting of a disability they can see. Okay.
Yes.
Oh, you're in a wheelchair, we're definitely going to make some accommodations for you. Oh, you have this condition. Oh, it's so wonderful that you're your own boss and you're running this restaurant, and it's celebrated for the differences because they can see that there's something there. But with individuals with FASD or brain-based conditions, FASD, autism, traumatic brain injury, epilepsy, like all these struggles, dyslexia, they're not, and dysgraphia, they're not celebrated for their strengths. They are judged, they are criticized for their inabilities as opposed to celebrated for their abilities. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
I have a
absolutely.
child that has FASD. She does not read yet. And she's trying and she's learning. But I can tell you this child is very resourceful and has learned that I can't read a recipe, but I can go and find a video that will talk me through it on how to make something. And let me tell you, that is amazing because this child has figured out how that is a life skill that is needed to survive in the future, to be able to make myself a meal, right? And this child has figured out at a young age, if I do this, I can learn how to make a meal without knowing how to read. Not saying that she doesn't want to learn to read, but this is a very important life skill that she has created a workaround so that she can learn.
And how old is she?
Fantastic. She's 9.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. I know, right?
Oh, the fact that she has a desire to learn how to cook, to have this life skill at 9 is an amazing thing.
Right? And I mean, I celebrate that. You made some amazing garlic mashed potatoes, honey, all on your own. She watched how they peeled them, and I just sat there and watched her do it. And it was amazing. And I got to celebrate that for her, which then boosted her confidence, right? Because now she's willing to try it again. And it wasn't like, oh, you have to read this recipe to learn how to make these garlic mashed potatoes. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't do that because you don't know how to read. Let's teach you how to read, and make her frustrated. She was able to find another way. And that's kind of what we need to do.
Until I was 9, because I was held back when I was 8 or 9 in third grade. So kind of like your daughter.
Yeah. And so she struggles, but she's also very smart, and a lot of individuals with FASD are smart. There's misinformation out there that, that they have a low IQ, and that's not true. I mean, they have really good IQ levels. It's just a matter of how to work, how to reach this population in a way that they, can work with, I guess is the word I'm looking for, but in strategies that are effective for them.
Well, the misconceptions sound very similar to the dyslexia misconceptions as well.
Absolutely.
Because it's the same thing. But, like you said, they don't look like they like a Down syndrome person looks different because they are missing a chromosome. When it's a neurodiverse, a neuro challenge, you don't see it because it's something that's not wired in the brain. It's not a chromosome that's missing, or a leg that's missing, or an arm that's missing.
Right. And that's the hard time. That's the hard part. And that's where individuals with FASD become so frustrated, because we hold them to these expectations that they might not be able to do at the time. They might have an uneven level of development. They may be great in sports, but really struggle with reading, or really struggle with certain other things, or social skills. And until we match that level of development where they're at for that task or that issue, they're going to be frustrated. Of course. I mean, yeah. So behaviors happen when an individual is misunderstood and there's a poor fit, basically. If you wore a size 9 shoe and I give you a size 5 and I say, wear it all day, what are you going to do to me? You're not going to wear it all day. You're probably going to take the shoe off and huck it at my face. Think about that. I mean, that's kind of what we're doing, or we're punishing. It's like punishing a blind person for saying you can't read the chalkboard. Is that effective? No. So it's kind of like that. That's my little soapbox.
Well,
so what other questions can I answer for you? Or
so I guess I kind of have a series of questions. My first one is, what should parents do to see if their child has FASD?
Some of the, I don't want to call them red flags, but that's a common terminology that is used. Some red flag warnings for FASD. Obviously, if you know that you have consumed alcohol during pregnancy, that's one. If you see that your child maybe is diagnosed with ADHD and they're not responding properly to ADHD medications that they might be put on, that might be another indicator to dig a little deeper. If there is, say the child has gone for IEP testing and there's a large scatter in data when they're doing the assessment, that's also a red flag.
What's a scatter in data mean?
A scatter in data means basically, usually when you do your testing, there's a certain area that your data will collect in. Okay. So when you're doing your testing, but there's going to be some here, there's going to be some over here, there's going to be outliers here. Then a lot of times that data is thrown out by school psychologists because it's considered extreme, or it skews the data. But sometimes that's an indicator of the brain domains that might have been impacted and which is working more effectively and which is not. So that's what I mean by scattered data, is when they're collecting the information, it doesn't all bubble up into their happy little normal curve that they're used to seeing.
So can a parent get access to that if the psychologist throws it out? Because
you can ask the psychologist, because they'll typically show you, but you may have to ask the psychologist if there was anything that was thrown out. They may not show you that information, so you kind of have to ask. If you think of
if your child is adopted,
the higher risks are if they are adopted or through foster care, and they start showing, challenges like cognitive deficits, executive functioning, like, time management, things like that, difficulty generalizing, struggling with memory, or another indicator is what I call a light bulb analogy, where they're doing a task and they've got it and it's fantastic. Oh, yes, we put our shoes on. We know how to put our shoes on, right? And then a day or two later, I have no idea how to put on their shoes. Right? It can be something like that. You have to relearn something. That is something that's definitely an indicator. Processing speed. Sometimes they have the on and off days where they're sometimes, it's kind of like the light bulb example where, they can do something one day with no help. Another time they may need a little bit of help. The next time they need all the help because their brain just doesn't seem to function. I was actually going to look at, I have something that may be helpful that I was just looking at, as opposed to some ideas based on age that might be helpful. And I just pulled it up when you were talking. So I am going to pull that up for you so that I can give you some more ideas for parents. So again, if you are unaware, like say you have a child that is foster or adopted, and you have no idea, alcohol confirmation during pregnancy is the only way to know for sure. FASD will not be diagnosed for like substance abuse such as marijuana or opioids or any of that. That will not be FASD. FASD is solely for alcohol. And so confirmation can come not just from the biological parent, but also a friend or a relative who has witnessed them consuming alcohol during pregnancy. Just so you know. Some ideas in toddlerhood might be sleep disruptions, like sleep problems, feeding difficulties, sensory issues and overwhelm, maybe not responding to traditional parenting discipline methods could be another indicator. Potentially delayed language development is also a good one to look at if it's infancy and toddlerhood. Preschool aged, you may be looking at continued difficulty with sleeping and eating, difficulty learning, not necessarily academics, but routines, difficulty learning routines, difficulty some with social aspects. They might have an ability to be over friendly, like stranger danger isn't really something that they grasp. Okay. They may have sensitivity to, again, it's like a sensory thing. Clothes might be too itchy smells, things like that. Hearing, vision, speech delay, those types of things can definitely happen. It could be you may be looking at your 4-year-old and thinking, they're kind of acting like a 2-year-old at this. Like, what is this? So that might be an indicator for that age group. In school-aged children, for parents, and I hope I'm not going too fast, again, we're going to continue with the sleep issues, potential ADHD diagnosis or types of behaviors. You may be looking at complex learning disabilities, as they struggle with. The most common is the math, like we talked about before, not responding well to discipline, having struggle with homework. Now when I say struggling with homework, I don't mean your typical struggling with homework. Like nearly every kid doesn't want to do homework, right? But we're talking the major meltdowns and battles that we have with homework and behavior, well, problems, as people call them, or meltdowns and that type of thing. A perception of lying, which isn't necessarily lying, it's confabulation, but we might interpret it as lying. There's a whole thing about that. And again, remember how we were talking about the friends issue? They can make friends, but they can't keep them. Keeping them is really hard. Something goes wrong. There's an interpretation problem. So that is for parents with young children. Now, when you get into, and school-age children, when you get into teenagers, it becomes even more challenging because this is the time, that's the time of age when independence is being really promoted, right? And a lot of individuals with FASD, when they're in the teens or the preteens, they need more interdependence. They don't need they need help. And that's when we're trying to take them away. We're trying to say, oh, well, you're growing now. You need to have, this. Curriculum becomes more abstract and concrete thinking is for FASD individuals. That makes it hard. There's a lot of transitions. There's a lot of change. That's one thing I didn't mention before. Going throughout, if they have a hard time transitioning, that's a big indicator as well. And difficulty with taking tests or retrieving information for individuals with FASD and teenagers. And it's hard because if there's like a loss of friends or they're not fitting in or something like that in this teen, that's a typical care that typically happens. So these are just little warning signs or ideas of what an individual with FASD might struggle with. So, and those are for parents, for individuals from infancy to teenagers. I mean, there's definitely adults living with FASD, and it's not with all of these ideas or examples, your child isn't broken. Your child doesn't need to be fixed. We just, as parents and as educators, need to understand their strengths and work with them to help bring them up and, give them the confidence that they can have and meet them where they're at.
That's really good advice because that advice is beneficial for any of our kids with neurodiversities, as well as someone who has FASD. So thank you for pointing that out.
Oh, you're welcome.
And so what's the best way to get help? To go to a doctor or to go to the school? Where do they get started?
That's a very good question. A lot of individuals will start with schools and school testing and see if the individual qualifies for an IEP. And that's going to be really where the rubber meets the road. Going to a doctor and getting a diagnosis is very helpful because that helps you have understanding as a parent to know what it is that we're dealing with, what it is that's going on. And so that we can educate ourselves as parents on how to work with individuals with FASD. However, that being said, a diagnosis is not going to guarantee an IEP, right? The child or teen must meet the requirements to have an IEP. And so there may be individuals with FASD that don't need an IEP, that are functioning completely fine. And they may have some struggles, but they've learned to work with them, or they have parents that have worked with them, whatever it is. So, or they might just need a 504. But parents going to a doctor, getting that information into the doctor, into the chart, it's helpful for the individual, for the student, because I can tell you, they know something's different. They know it. And so we as parents also need to listen to our kids. And I'm going to give you an example, a personal example for me is I have a daughter that has FASD, She is now grown. She's now officially an adult recently. And I remember when she was younger, she would say, Mom, something is wrong with my brain. Now, being the mom that I am and wanting her to not feel bad about herself, I responded with, oh, honey, nothing's wrong with your brain. You have a beautiful brain, which is in fact true. However, she was trying to communicate to me her struggle, and I missed it. And it took me a little bit longer to figure it out, probably a year or two. And I was like, oh, she was trying to tell me something. I needed to listen better. I could have gotten her help 2 years prior. Mm-hmm. So for us as parents, it's hard sometimes. We have to listen and try, I guess. As you know, I don't know how to say it, but like, I missed it. I don't want someone else to miss it, because my child could have had help 2 years prior and could have, had less stress.
And what is help? What is the help that they get?
Different types of an IEP. They can get different types of accommodations to their academic environment, certain types of help, certain tools, and also, honestly, parenting and having the school understand what FASD is and how to work with individuals with FASD, and parenting approaches.
And how do you get that parenting education, since there's very few people who really know what it is?
There are several different ways to get that parenting. There's a couple organizations that teach what they call a neurobehavioral model. It's the Facets neurobehavioral model. Facets is an organization. It was created by Diane Malbin, and she pioneered this neurobehavioral model approach, and it has been so effective with individuals with FASD. I myself teach classes as well. I'm a certified facilitator for this organization. And so if individuals have FASD and they want to learn more on how to parent, I help with that. And I teach classes there. Like I said, there's several different organizations that are supportive and helpful. There's networks like, there's FASD Network of Southern California, Northern California. There's FASD Now. We are working on legislative changes that actually recently came into play. SB 1016 now allows FASD to be an eligible category under OHI, under other health impairment, for an IEP. So the nice thing about that is if an individual has FASD, they can go in. I mean, anybody can request an IEP evaluation. However, this is an additional identifying subcategory, so to speak, so that teachers and educators and admin and school psychologists need to know about it. So that's pretty cool.
That's great. And I didn't realize that you taught classes for this. So
I do.
And so do you teach
I don't promote that.
Well,
I'm really bad at that.
I think that's very important to share, because there's not a lot of education available. So, do you teach them online and in person, or just online?
Yes, I do both. I have gone places and taught them. I have traveled to teach. So I will teach parents, professionals, organizations. I've done a lot for organizations, like foster and adoption, not just agencies, but here in LA County, through DCFS, whole bunches of organizations, different conferences and things. I will go. Yes, it's important because these are tools that are going to help create more positive outcomes for individuals with FASD.
Wonderful. And then tell us a bit more about your services with IEPs.
Okay, so what I do is I help parents through the process. I support families. The key player in an IEP is the student, first and foremost. My approach, I help families through not only the process, but also helping them with like their parent input statements, what their struggles are, their concerns, ideas for how to work with their students to create a collaborative approach with the IEP team. So I go in basically to support the families. I don't go in as an advocate, because I don't want to, I like the collaborative cohesive environment. I know it's not always easy to create that. That's the approach I like to take, because the most important person in that IEP team is the student, the one who's going to be receiving the services. So I walk families right through it. I'll attend a meeting if they want me to, or I will empower them to do it on their own, whatever works for them. My goal is that they don't ever need me again. I know that sounds funny, but I want to work myself out of a job, basically, right? But I mean, all that to say, even as a parent, I still hire someone to help me because I'm emotionally attached to my children. And it's hard sometimes when it's your own child to go through the IEP process.
Yes.
Yeah. So that is what I do. So, and I also train parents about IEPs. So I'll go in for an organization and like a foster parent agency or someone and tell them what the IEP process even is, because some parents don't even know, they don't know that there's this option out there, and schools aren't just going to say, hey, let's give your student an IEP, especially with all the shortages happening. They're not going to just like, hey, so that's what I do.
And so what's the best way for people to get a hold of you, for our podcast listeners?
Oh, they can go to my website at embracingthebrain.com, or they can email me at shannon@embracingthebrain.com. And that's it. That's an easy way to get a hold of me. Yep.
Sounds
and I try to answer emails as quickly as possible. So, and what I'll do is if someone wants help, I usually will say, great, thanks for contacting me. Here's a couple of dates and times I'm available. Let's talk. Because I'm very much on that personal connection. I think it's important as opposed to just a whole bunch of emails. So I want to talk to you. I want to find out what your concerns are and if we're a good fit so that I can help you. Yeah.
Sounds amazing. Well, Shannon, thank you so much for taking your time out of your busy day and helping us out with this information that is so important, because most of us have had drinks while we're pregnant, and shedding light on it so that there isn't shame surrounded around getting our children the help that we need, that we may feel guilty and not want to address it. So,
and that's a big key, because we don't want there to be stigma and shame. And you're absolutely right. You know what? If I had consumed alcohol during pregnancy and disclosing that information to get my child what they need, that's what's most important, is getting the child what they need. There's so many variables. My personal belief is no person drinks intentionally to harm their unborn child. And so there's a reason why it happened, and it wasn't just blatant. So taking that approach is a very important approach.
Thank you. That's a great way to end our interview. Appreciate it, Shannon.
You're welcome.